everyone. My name is Monica Murray, and I am the Public Programming Officer at the New York City Department of Records and Information Services, also known as DORIS. DORIS houses the city's municipal archives and library and is focused on fostering civic life by preserving and providing access to the historical and contemporary records of the New York City government and its people. Today, we're excited to welcome Dr. David Viola. David is an adjunct professor at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City and completed his Ph.D. in U.S. and Middle Eastern history at the CUNY Graduate Center in 2017. Dr. Viola is also an intelligence officer in the U.S. Navy Reserve and is currently mobilized to active duty in Europe in support of the U.S. Special Operations Forces. On April 22nd, HarperCollins Hanover Square Press released his first book, You Have Unleashed a Storm, New York City's Descent into Chaos During America's Most Explosive Era of Radical Violence, which David will discuss today. So without further ado, I will turn the floor over to David.
Thank you very much for that, and thank you for joining everyone who's here in the room today, and many of you in New York and many of you perhaps elsewhere. So thank you for coming and joining us today. Yeah, really excited to be here and to talk to you all specifically about not just the book, but more importantly the New York City Municipal Archive and more specifically even than that, the NYPD intelligence records, the handshoe records, as I referred to, and the role that they played not just in You Have Unleashed a Storm in my book, but also in all the tremendous research that is going to come out of that has already come out of it. Several other remarkable books have already happened because of the archive and this collection, and I think that a bunch of them are going to be coming soon. And just a brief overview of some of the things that I'm going to talk about today. Just talk to you really quickly about a quick introduction to the very long history of NYPD intelligence practices, a really quick, brief rundown of what handshoe is and what that refers to for some of you who may not be familiar with it. And then we'll spend some time discussing the actual collection and which aspects of it I used for this book. Next slide, please. So the NYPD, the New York Police Department, has had an intelligence function for even decades longer than the FBI itself has existed. And what that function inside of NYPD has looked like and what they have focused on, and to what lengths they have gone in pursuit of those functions has evolved over the past almost a century and a quarter, almost about 120 years at this point. If I had to generalize, I would say this, and the handshoe collection bears this out, that NYPD's intelligence function, just like the intelligence functions at other agencies at the federal level, as well as at other local, state, and municipal level, throughout all of American history, have focused considerably more on the perceived threat from political actors on the left of the American spectrum than on the right of the American spectrum. And I don't think that would surprise many people. The earliest real version of NYPD intelligence was the Italian Squad, which was stood up just after the turn of the century in about 1906 as a secretive unit inside of the police department to combat what was then called the Black Hand, an underground group of Italian and Italian-American extortionists. The Italian Squad then became the Bomb and Radical Squad, which shifted focus during the years of anarchism in the United States and anarchism terrorism that spread throughout the country, including the 1920 the Wall Street bombing at the JP Morgan Bank, which incidentally is about a 5-minute walk from the municipal archive itself. That bombing killed 38 people and wounded hundreds of others and was, without close second, the deadliest act of terrorism in New York City history until September 11th. The Bomb and Radical Squads shifts in the years after 1920, and then the years that I focus on in my own research are what I like to think of as the core years of NYPD's intelligence functions, when it was known as the Bureau of Special Services and Investigations, or BOSSI. Even in the years after they dropped investigations from that title, it was still referred to as BOSSI by the public, by the police department, by anyone who knew what it was. And it was still referred to as BOSSI up until about the time of the handshoe lawsuit, which was filed in 1971. The NYPD Intelligence Division is what eventually shakes out in the years following Hanshu, and that's the name of the function, of the much transformed intelligence function at NYPD today. Pictured here, incidentally, are some of the officers at the center of bossy investigations during the 1960s and 1970s. That lower photo there, on the right side of that photo, is William Knapp, who was commanding officer of bossy. And incidentally, the photos that I was able to find in the municipal archive in this record, these are the only photos that I've ever seen anywhere of William Knapp. That top photo is John Kinsella and Albert Seidman, two other legendary cops at the center of bossy investigations, who are very public figures who have a public record elsewhere. Um, okay, next slide, please. So, what is Hanshu? And again, for those of you who are unfamiliar, Hanshu was a class action lawsuit filed against Bossy, the NYPD, the commissioner of the police department, the mayor at the time, and it was filed almost immediately following the outcome of the historic Panther 21 case in 1971, which was indeed was a low point period for NYPD and specifically for Bossy. Bossy was very central to that investigation and won't get into the details of it, but it was a massive, massive failure and a massive unveiling of the kind of things that Bossy was doing, which would help precipitate the lawsuit. The lawsuit essentially alleged a really widespread campaign over the course of decades of violations of New Yorkers' civil liberties by these various intelligence units inside the police department. The lawsuit alleged unwarranted infiltration of political groups by undercover police officers and by informants, physical and electronic surveillance, and the collection of just massive troves of political intelligence with no lawful basis whatsoever, no warrants, no nothing. The filing of the suit happened to coincide in 1971 with the tenure of two men who were actually committed reformers in New York and on a national level as well, that being the mayor, John Lindsay, and police commissioner Patrick Murphy, who were the 1971 version of legitimate reformers. And it was all coming to a head at the same time, to tell you the truth. And truth be told, the police department didn't so much deny the activities that were alleged in the lawsuit. They really just denied that they were unconstitutional. The filing of the lawsuit wasn't the end of political policing for NYPD, but in hindsight, it was definitely a sign that the most egregious activities of Bossy and the units that then followed it were in the past. And in 1985, federal judge Charles Haight Jr. Approved a settlement, but long before that, the police department had already significantly rolled back at least the most invasive of its unwarranted intelligence practices over the previous decades. And I don't want to get too much into it, what NYPD intelligence looks like in the years after that, but there is a fantastic book that some of you may already be familiar with called Enemies Within by Adam Goldman and Matt Apuzzo that was based on their Pulitzer Prize winning reporting, and then they turned it into a book which looks at post 9/11 NYPD intelligence practices. Next slide, please. So I'll take a moment now to transition back to the actual Hanshu records, to the NYPD intelligence records, this massive trove of kind of game-changing records that the municipal archive is making available to scholars and that I use in putting my book together. In 2016, a professor at CUNY, Professor Fernandez at Baruch, and I think also at the Graduate Center now, was looking into NYPD's investigations into the Young Lords for a new book of hers. And eventually, what she and her lawyer turned up were these 500 boxes of intelligence files that became the collection that were, I don't want to say completely forgotten about. They had been intentionally forgotten about by NYPD and obfuscated and put in literally in a dusty warehouse in Queens until Professor Fernandez and her lawyer had finally achieved what, at that point, decades of civil liberty activists had been trying to do and get these boxes out. And something to note here that even though there's more than 500 boxes of NYPD intelligence records that the archives are making available to us, which is a gold mine for researchers, the frightening truth is that those 500 boxes represent a fraction of the intelligence records that NYPD had generated over the course of its over its existence. Um, I see Joel raising his hand now, and why don't we save these questions to the end? But um, we have on the line here one of the original plaintiffs for Hanshu, which is going to be great to hear from when we get to him. In any case, so yeah, these 500 boxes, they might seem like a lot, and they are a lot. They are literally a gold mine. But in 1973, the NYPD destroyed 1 million records of its own volition during the Hanshu, during the run-up to the Hanshu, to the resolution of that. And civil libertarians think that that's not the NYPD doing anyone any favors, but really just so that the NYPD could no longer be held accountable for the records that it had created. In any case, 500 boxes of records is a gold mine, and I'm so grateful that they exist, but it is very sobering to know what the NYPD had generated over the course of generations prior to that. Next slide, please. So let me dig into the records themselves a little bit. The first classification, and the the records are broken down into different categories. And the first classification, that how I saw them, of records are the personal records, the individual files, the dossiers that Bossie had created for pretty much anyone they thought might be subversive. Here are just a few records, and these are just notional and just representative. The first is for an activist, a man by the name of John Cohn, who's associated with Sam Melville and Jane Alpert and a collection of leftist Weather Underground types who had bombed several New York City locations in 1969, that I wrote about in my book and that others have written about in their work as well. Cohn was never arrested, never even charged with a crime as far as I know. He may or may not have played some minor role in the conspiracy, but clearly not enough evidence existed to warrant even bringing him up for questioning. But that didn't stop him from getting a dossier at Bossie. This second file here, this middle file here, is a front page of at least one of the dossiers that Bossie had on Malcolm X. And this dossier specifically stretches several dozen pages long, including his address, his former address, all of his former addresses, his work history, his personal details, his professional details, etc. It is staggering the amount of information that they had on him, second only probably in the nation to the FBI. And this last document I just put in because I kind of found it entertaining. And I always did. When I first found it, I thought it was entertaining. It's just a letter, request from Treasury Department to Bossie to see if they had any information on one Bob Dylan. And this is just months after Dylan broke out, which I don't know the story behind it, but it was just a curious record. Um, and there's a lot of records like this that are very curious and very interesting and the tip of an iceberg that we really can't see beneath, but that's for other researchers to get into, I guess. Next slide, please. So the next brand of Hanshu documents that I used were reports from informants and more often from undercover police infiltrators, policemen and in some cases police women, who were going out into the community and infiltrating the movements that they would then report on. These are the lion's share of what I use to recreate the narrative and uncover the history for this book. Literally for generations, NYPD was sending these men and women out, the ones who were police men and women, often with minimal training and very often without a single day of police training or any kind of training in terms of what would constitute a legal search or entrapment or et cetera, et cetera. And, they're out there spying on Americans for their political activity with no warrant and usually no suggestion at all that they might be involved with any kind of criminal activity. These records they're sobering, to tell you the truth. The first record is one that I actually didn't use in the book. It was a Bossie infiltrator reporting on Progressive Labor Party on a PLP meeting for literally no reason other than their leftist politics. And the files on Progressive Labor and other organizations like that, like CORE, that were never charged or thought of with being violent or committing any crimes, that is what is staggering about this collection and about this activity over the course of the 20th century and perhaps beyond. The second is a long report from Bossy infiltrator Ray Wood. Ray Wood spent a grand total of 0 days as a police officer before Bossy sent him out. They recruited him, showed him his badge, took his badge away, and immediately sent him out into the community to go infiltrate what CORE, which the Congress of Racial Equality, which many of you are probably familiar with. And from there, he involved himself by navigating the community with radicals from Revolutionary Action Movement, or RAM, and that was then a linchpin of Officer Wood breaking up a plot to bomb the Statue of Liberty. At the time of the trial, there were serious allegations of whether or not the plot was really entrapment, the manifestations of an overzealous police rookie who had not spent a day on the job and was just very much trying to make the case. It did result in conviction, so that is justice being done. But there were significant concerns about the kind of things that came back with the Panther 21 case just a few years later. In any case, these are just two examples. These kinds of infiltrator informant records, they permeate the entire collection, from Progressive Labor to CORE to other organizations that I researched, like the extreme right-wing Minutemen, the Black Panthers, the Revolutionary Action Movement. The list goes on and on. Next slide, please. And then here we have case files from investigations into what actually were crimes, including many of the bombings that appear in the pages of my book. Since Bossy was a unit responsible for all crimes related to subversive elements, and that definition could be really, really loose, they were the aspect of the NYPD's detective division, or detectives department, detectives bureau, that was tasked with these kinds of investigations of politically motivated violence, if you'll put it that way, terrorism. And politically motivated violence being a political crime, regardless of where in the political spectrum those actors came from, that was a specific mandate for Bossy. The first document here is part of Bossy's investigation into what was a pivotal moment in 1960s and 1970s political violence in the United States, that being the accidental detonation of a massive dynamite bomb that the three or several very young Weather Underground radicals were building in a townhouse on West 11th Street. The bomb accidentally detonated, wounding a few and killing three. I think the average age of the young radicals who died was 23 years old. These are kids. Demolished the entire townhouse entirely. The bomb was intended to target a non-commissioned officer dance at Fort Dix in nearby New Jersey, I think later that day or later that week. And who knows what kind of damage it could have done if that had happened. And Bossy was already kind of becoming a little bit sidelined because of the attention they were getting, but they were obviously very involved in the investigation of this as well. These records here, the photographs of, and this is a pivotal moment in the 60s and into the 70s. These records have never been seen by anybody until other researchers and myself started looking at them. The photographs of the detonation and the explosion of the townhouse, they're tough to look at, some of them, but they have never been seen by anyone else. And that kind of photographic record is also very important. Um, and actually, Bossy incidentally was more effective at getting an infiltrator into the Weather Underground than I think the FBI was. Officer Steve Weiner was so close to the center of Weatherman that he was actually present at the infamous War Council, I think out in Detroit, when the decision was made to actually take Weatherman underground and become Weather Underground. He was outed after an arrest in 1972 on the Upper East Side that he helped to effect as some other folks tried to bomb a bank, but he was right at the middle of it. The second document here is from one of the several infiltrators that Bossy had in the Minutemen, this extreme right-wing anti-communist organization that I'd mentioned. That was pretty, even in the very anti-communist 1960s, they were on the fringe. I feel like today they might be very welcome in certain parts of DC. And in any case, the Minutemen case was one of the first incidents in the 1960s in New York of a pretty expansive bombing plot and turned to violence. And I think these records here, the Hanshu records, help me to make the case that even though the 1960s is often argued as a time of excessive left-wing violence in the United States, these records here really helped to show that one, in New York, it didn't start with the left. It was those on the right, like the Minutemen. Two, it included those on the right, like the Minutemen and other organizations, which I think is a statement that needs to be contributed to the general perception of the 1960s and 1970s. Um, okay, next slide, please. And then here, we'll finally here what we have are some of the documents that I made a lot of use of in the book that are collected material that Bossi had collected during their infiltrations of these movements and their investigations. And these run the gamut from pamphlets, flyers, private letters, other personal documents obtained without a warrant, of course, um, communiques from organizations like the Weather Underground, and newspaper clippings. And I'm sorry that these materials from the American Nazi Party are pretty objectionable, but the ANP said, did, or created nothing that was not objectionable, to be perfectly honest. Uh, Next slide, please. Here are some similar materials from the Jewish Defense League, a radical, violent organization started by a Brooklyn rabbi by the name of Meir Kahane that resorted to bombings and violent protests and other types of violence in the JDL's advocacy of Jewish issues in New York and Jewish issues around the world. This middle flyer here denouncing a Jewish concert promoter by the name of Saul Yurok was part of their protest of the concert promoter for his dealings with the Soviet Union, who the JDL believed to be oppressing Soviet Jews. This ultimately led to the JDL firebombing his offices in Midtown, an attack that led to several hospitalizations and the death of one person who happened to be a young Jewish woman from Queens. Next slide, please. And I will say this. Some of these records that are sitting inside of a folder at the archive in this collection, like these three here, can be sitting on the wall of a museum. Like they are really that remarkable, I feel. These are just more collected material. The first is the 21 is a reference to a rally for the Panther 21, which became the Panther 13 before the resolution of the case. And again, this case was the beginning of the precipitous downfall of Bossi, as well as immediately a few days later became with the filing of the Hanshu case itself. This second one is a rally in support of Sam Melville, who I'd spoken about earlier, who was arrested and convicted along with two other of his compatriots for a bombing campaign in 1969 at various places around New York in protest of the Vietnam War, of American imperialism, in support of civil rights and other associated aspects of the leftist movement at the time. And this one here at the big red circle, big red star, is an actual original communique from the Weather Underground that was sent. I think this went to the Daily News, that now resides in a collection following a Weather Underground bombing of a courthouse in Long Island City. Um, these are really tremendous records and just sitting there for us researchers to get out there and geek out on and make history out of. Um, Next slide, please. Um, and here's some more collected material related to FALN, a Puerto Rican nationalist terrorist organization that during the 1970s became what I'm fairly certain, and an author by the name of Brian Burrow first made the case that they are the most prolific terrorist bombers in all of American history. And they got their start here in New York, and they caused a considerable amount of of death and destruction in New York between the early to mid part of the 1970s all the way into the 1980s. And the record, the art, this collection has a tremendous amount of records, a lot of collected records on FALN. At this point, looking into Hanshu's already been filed, the investigations into FALN are nowhere near as intrusive as they are of organizations that came in the years prior to them. And some at Bosse or some at NYPD made the argument that it was because their hands were tied behind their backs because of, the Constitution, that they were not able to be more effective in rolling up FALN. And it just brings about that age-old conversation about the trade-off that we always need to negotiate between our civil liberties and our security. Um, Next slide, please. I'd alluded to it once or twice, but another really important aspect of the Hanshu collection that I really look forward to others digging into are the Hanshu photo files. Um, Bosse invested a great deal in their professionalization of their photography and even filmmaking capabilities. And the photos aren't only of historic significance, they're also pretty often captured with substantial skill and even I'd say artistry, which is weird for what they are. But if Ouija could do it, some members of Bosse could do it also. I'm not overstating it when I say that there are countless photos here of real historic value, photos that have never been seen by the general public, just waiting to be brought into the light to let some others tell important stories. And, I'm a filmmaker by trade, and the number of compelling documentaries that are just waiting to be told by the photographic record sitting here is just limited by our imagination. Um, Next slide, please. These first photos are from protests by the NRP, the National Renaissance Party, a pretty disgusting white supremacist organization based out of the owner's townhouse just off of Central Park West on the Upper West Side. You'll see these numbers here. If you look, the little blue numbers on top of the individuals, you'll see these here on many Hanshu photos. And on the back of the photos, Bosse and their informants identify the individuals who are usually known activists. At the end of the day, these numbers are a reminder. For as much as I appreciate the photos from an artistic and a historic record perspective, these photos weren't taken for the sake of art. They were taken for, you know, they're intelligence records. They're not taken for historic, posterity. They're taken to impose on the civil liberties of New Yorkers. And even repugnant shitheads like the NRP deserve the right to freely express their disgusting beliefs. And even though Bosse was much less concerned with these types than they were with others on the other end of the political spectrum, they still ended up in the files. Next slide, please. Here are some more photos of NRP rallies, and what's old is new again, folks. They're not protesting on the streets anymore. They're hanging out in the White House. Next slide, please. Here are just a few of the literally thousands of photos and pretty moving images that Bosse captured during the various protests in the late 60s and 70s. And some of the events you'll see referenced in these photos are among the most, significant socio-political events in New York and the nation during the era. The Vietnam War, the Panthers, the trial of the Panther 21, the murder of Fred Hampton in Chicago. This is a pretty significant historical record waiting to be tapped into. Next slide, please. Here are just some more. In truth, I didn't make it through every single one of the photo records. A lot of them are negatives. Sitting there with a light box is time consuming. These are two photos that were just negatives. There weren't even prints made. And when I saw them on a light box, these are just two images that, are now among the favorite images in existence for me. Yeah, and they're an intelligence record. And next slide, please. And here, this is just, again, just as a historic record. Here you go with some literally never before seen pictures of Martin Luther King, Coretta Scott King, and Mayor Wagner just sitting in the archive, just waiting to be made use of by folks like us, folks who care about this. Um, some good, very unintentionally may have come out of some of the collection that Bossy did over these years. And next slide, please. And I think that that's what I have for you guys today, in terms of prepared stuff, and you know, ready to talk, answer any questions I can answer.
Well, thank you for all of that, David.
Thank you.
So yeah, we're going to turn it over to Q&A, and we're going to see what people have brought up here. It was a lot, so
Uh-oh.
I already have some for sure. So one person here is already asking, in today's post 9/11 mass surveillance state, what advice would you have for peaceful groups to safeguard their persons, meetings, and tech from illegal spying? And that's definitely something there with all the photos you were showing with Bossy, looking there.
Yeah, I think what I would say about that is that we can't escape it. We do live in a surveillance state. You have an ad identity, and I'm going to keep this very much out of the realm of what I do in my day job side currently, as I'm actually an intelligence officer. So, like I'll keep it out of that and just talk about it from, the civil libertarian and the historian perspective. But we all know that we live in a surveillance state. We create most of that ourselves, with our online profiles and where we use our credit cards and whatnot. And, you know, I don't think we can avoid that. And I think that avoiding it actually looks more suspect than just living the life that we live, not having a Instagram account or any kind of social media and having a dumb phone instead of a smartphone, you look like you're trying to do something and not get caught doing it. So I would say, personally, I would say live your life. And, there are a lot of activists in here who ended up in records, and that is sobering and that is scary and that is unconstitutional, and we need to push back against that, like the plaintiffs of Hanshu did, including one of the folks on the line here. Um, but I think that it's when you take activism to the level that some of the other folks in my book and in these records, like the Minutemen or like Sam Melville or whoever, I think that that's when we're in trouble. And the reality is that all the intelligence records that Bossy had created in the 1960s and 1970s, that's available for anybody now, without having to allow for an intelligence agency to go collect it. We create it ourselves and kind of give it to the world. So, move to a desert island and throw your cell phone on out the airplane on the way out there, or just kind of like that's the world we live in.
Thanks for that. This goes in line with that, but what would you say the balance is today between privacy rights and keeping us secure, besides moving to a desert island?
I do think that the sobering tale of Bossy and the FBI is the other big part of the book that we didn't talk about, but that was reprimanded even more than Bossy was during the same time frame for what they were doing. I think that while I was writing the book, we lived in a time where we didn't need to worry about that much of an egregious overstep by the agencies that were entrusted with our security, like police departments and like federal agencies. Since January, I don't know that that's true anymore. Um, with um, with IGs being removed from the agencies, I just don't know what the next few years is going to look like, um, to be perfectly honest. I do think that there's a place for activism, obviously, but I don't know that you're not going to be collected upon, and I don't know that it's not going to be held against you, to be honest.
Okay, thank you for that.
Oh, I'm full of bad news today. I'm sorry.
It's okay. It's okay. It's with everything that you've shared today. It's a mix of good and bad. We'll say that. How did you gain access to all of this? Did you file a FOIA request, or was this just coming into to your doors to the archives? Can you tell us a little more about the behind the scenes making of this?
So I'll say this much. Before I had discovered the archive, before I had discovered these 500 boxes of gold for researchers like us, as I was just starting to write my PhD, which parts of that became the book, I had filed a number of freedom of information requests, a FOIL request with NYPD, and it is hilarious what I got back. I literally got back, I think, after all these requests and several months, I got back a handful of pages on the Black Panthers, which was nothing interesting, which was less informative than like a poorly written Wikipedia page. And to the rest of it, I got a very legalistic worded letter from NYPD basically telling me to go screw myself. So if not for people like Professor Fernandez and the other activists who kept searching for these records over the course of a generation or two, this book quite literally does not happen. It just does not happen. A fantastic book a few years ago on the hard hat riots, that book does not happen. You know, so that was my process. And once we got into it, I was looking at these records even as Rosie Mendez and the great folks down at the archive were still trying to catalog them. And I'm like snipping on their heels, trying to like get into records that they haven't even cataloged yet. Um, that work I think is finally concluding now, if I'm not mistaken. Um, but the digitizing of these records, none of that existed yet. So I was literally just looking through records, and the story was revealing itself as I was going through these records. Um, I didn't look at all 500 boxes. I probably looked at a good half of them. Um, and I was not looking specifically for records that I didn't know were in there to for me it was about looking through there to see what was in there because nobody knew quite what was there. But that's the historical process, right? Historians live in dusty archives.
So how was that for you, Will? Will, you were constantly uncovering new things. What surprises, anything like that uncovered itself?
Yeah, I mean that Weather Underground communique that I shared the photo of, no, for me it was like little moments like that. I found that and I literally picked it up and I'm like sitting there like, does anyone see this? You know? And you know, those kind of moments, like I think that New York Times gotten a hold of that same communique. They'd probably mimeographed it or something back in the day, like like a year or two ago. But when I saw that, that didn't exist in the historical record. So for me, the moments when I'm going through these boxes and finding these records, as a historian, it's exciting finding things like that. On the other side of it, I'm finding these very personal records and these very invasive reports. I mentioned Officer Ray Wood, his after action report, his last report before the arrest, I believe, was like 50 something pages. And, you know, it's pretty invasive, you know, like I'm looking now at the invasive action that these officers and these informants had taken that was at the heart of the handshoe complaint. Um, so for me, it was exciting, but it's also sobering to know what it was all coming from.
Thank you for that. So we have someone who asks, they say, we're working with a student investigating the CIA's infiltration of academia, including our university. What advice would you have for a young researcher just starting out in archival research on this topic?
So I've dealt with and again, one that's really interesting and exciting, and there are some good baseline research that has been done in the last several years. Forgetting the name of a couple of the books that even I had read just to sort of like get an insight into how researchers and how historians had tried to utilize the Freedom of Information Act. It's different now because the Freedom of Information Act is very backed up in terms of what they can get after. I haven't seen the exact numbers, but I imagine that the people working in that end of the federal government have been reduced in half by Elon Musk in the past couple of months. So that backlog is just probably doubled or tripled in size now. So you might have to start filing your request very quickly and literally wait years. Even I had to wait. I wrote on an organization called Cuban Power that was a movement more than an organization that had bombed a bunch of places in New York in 1968, anti-Castro Cuban extremists. Um, and some of the Freedom of Information Act requests that I had filed with the FBI about Cuban Power, you know, they would get in touch with me to negotiate, but like we found, you know, 3,000 records that might be responsive to your request. It's going to take us 3 years, but we can get you 500 records in 6 months. So sometimes that negotiation happens. And sometimes I'd say yes because I wanted to not wait 3 years to finish the book. Um, so that will happen. And what I would also say is be very overlap your freedom of information request. Um, don't do it on an just if you're looking at an organization or at a university, CIA and Harvard or whatever it might be. Also do CIA and the dean of Harvard and just double them up. Um, the Internet Archive I found tremendously useful in terms of other scholars and other researchers taking their freedom of information requests that had been returned and then sharing them with the world. So you don't have to reinvent the wheels. So if it's something big like that, somebody's probably already looked at it.
That's really good advice. So thank you for that. Could you please explain how you define terrorism in your talk as it pertains to how the NYPD defines it in these records? And has that term been redefined across time?
The interesting thing is that in these records, the NYPD doesn't really refer to terrorism per se. It's more academics and the press who are referring to terrorism. And the way that I teach it to a lot of my students, and even at work sometimes, is that terrorism is very basically political violence. It's symbolic political violence. It is a violent political act intended to send a message where the intent of the violence isn't some tactical advantage like retaking territory. The entire intent of the violent act is to send a message in service of the underlying politics. So it doesn't need to kill anyone necessarily. It doesn't not need to kill anyone. But blowing up a bank like Cuban Power did and leaving leaflets there talking about the downfall of Castro, they could care less about a bank. It was a symbolic target that was meant to project their message. The same thing with the Minutemen did. They tried to burn down some leftist camps, red diaper baby camps on upstate New York and in the Connecticut area, not because they cared about the individual kids at these camps, but because they're projecting a message, their violent, anti-communist extremist message to anyone within range of listening to that message. And the case that I make for it in the book is that because terrorism is about the message, there is no greater of a stage than New York City in the world. If you want people to listen to your message, shout it out in New York, and that it will be heard. Even today, I don't want to give anyone any stupid ideas, but a pipe bomb exploding in a mailbox in the middle of Times Square is front page news. A pipe bomb exploding in a mailbox in the middle of somewhere in Idaho isn't front page news on the local paper even. I hope that answers that question.
I think it does. And it actually feeds into our next one. What was it like going through all of these archives? And are there any concerns from your end sharing some of these documents and photos?
No, and I do have I have a top secret security clearance, and I employ that at work, every day. I very intentionally went the way of only public records and nothing that lives in my brain to write this book. If I were to write a book on something that's happening now in the world, it would be a little bit hard to compartmentalize what I know from the classified world and what I know from the public record world. I knew nothing about Cuban Power from my personal life or Sam Melville from my personal life because I just wasn't alive when these things happened. So from my perspective, I have no fears for sharing these records. They're all sitting in the municipal archive, or they were given to me by the FBI, or the National Archives. Um, and if someone comes knocking on my door because of public records that I shared in a book, then we should all be very concerned, not just me.
Thank you. No spoilers here, I promise. The book concludes with the sentence, "The lesson that future generations take from this story are theirs to decide." What lessons do you take from uncovering these archived stories for society today?
Um, I really do think, I mean, who said it? That history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And I think that an unfortunate amount of things that we have seen in the last several years, um, they rhyme with what happened in the 60s and the 70s. They're not repetitious. It's not the same, but it looks scarily similar, both on the side of what's happening on. I actually have a lot of respect for NYPD. And I think that personally, I think that they've done a very good job on not going back to the well, let's say that. Uh, the FBI under the current director, not sure. I'm not certain. And whether or not political violence becomes something that Americans embrace again, because this 1960s and 1970s wasn't the first time that we've embraced political violence. We're a pretty effing violent society over the course of 250 years now when it comes to our politics. I hope that we don't go back to that well again. But I mean, January 6th is or January 6th, whatever. It's like, I was in a hotel across the street from the White House when that happened. And it wasn't the first time that any of us have seen that. So I hope that people remember their history and I hope that they look at it and say, we don't want to do that. We don't want to make those mistakes. I do think that the idea of political violence, or at least what we would call terrorism, was dramatically changed by September 11th. Prior to September 11th, any variety of organizations and individuals would do things like blow up a bank window, people on the left, people on the right, people in the middle, people who are religious, people who are secular. Um, and it was kind of what I argue, it was kind of an acceptable, radical, but an acceptable form of political protest. It's not anymore, not since September 11th. The idea of terrorism has a completely different connotation with thousands of New Yorkers dead on the street or dead and gone. So I'm hopeful that we don't go back there, but I don't think that avoiding political violence at all is a certainty. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Was there a moment during your door searching or a handshoe document that just truly set you back in your chair with surprise? Or any surprises that you found you thought maybe everyone should know about?
Yeah, there's a lot of them. It's those little moments like I said, like finding like the Weather Underground document. And it's hard to pick at any one because they just kept happening. A lot of the personal files were really, they felt invasive. Because I know that some of these people, if they have passed, that people who knew them, their families perhaps are still around, and it's invasive to have these records created about people you cared about for doing nothing other than going to a protest. Um, and even these photos that we were showing, something as simple as having a photo of you sitting in an archive for holding a sign that says "End the War in Vietnam." Every single moment, every one of those was kind of a sobering moment, was a memorable moment. That they just became kind of voluminous. Um, a scholar that I had worked with by the name of Beverly Gage, a mentor of mine who won the Pulitzer last year for her book on J. Edgar Hoover, had written a number of years ago about finding an FBI letter in a just like in a record there, which is one of the COINTELPRO records about the FBI basically telling Martin Luther King to commit suicide, and like I don't want to speak for Beverly, but I think that a lot of us have these same kind of experiences where we find a record and we're both thrilled at the history that we get to speak about, but we're also sobered, and we're scared about that this happened, that this is the history of it, you know?
Can you talk about any bossy conflicts with the FBI? Do they not always see eye to eye?
That's a great question. And I'm sorry, to be honest, I'm sorry I didn't touch on that here. Um, what Before these bossy records were available, when I first started researching this a million years ago, it was actually Beverly Gage who had suggested to me that the only way, or a good way to get a look at Bossy and NYPD, was to use FBI records to sort of like look around the curtain a little bit, because FBI and Bossy had such a tight relationship that FBI records were very often talking about their conversations with Bossy. Um, so that was my original way to look at it. And now it became the other way around, that these Bossy records, because of municipal archives, are so available now that I got such a great insight into FBI records that are becoming harder and harder to access because of the backlogs and because of, you know, ridiculous kind of redactions that still happen. But the basis of the question is a relationship, and the relationship between them was insanely tight. The FBI actually had a special agent, Gus Mychek, I believe was his name, sitting at Bossy as a full-time detail over to Bossy just to create that linkage. They went on raids together. Jane Alpert was one of the individuals arrested with Sam Melville in 1969, October of 1969. Uh, Charged with that bombing campaign. And it was FBI agents and NYPD detectives running up the stairs of their apartment there together and banging on that door together. Their relationship was very, very tight. And this relationship is what becomes the basis of what is today the Joint Terrorism Task Force. The very first their very first FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force is actually the FBI NYPD Joint Terrorism Task Force that starts in 1980, 1981 here in New York, or there in New York, because I'm not in New York, but in New York, and is based entirely on the relationship that Bossy and FBI had for generations at that point. They went and said that it was based on like the Joint Bank Robbery Task Force or something like that, which is a bunch of BS. They said that because it was better than saying we're basing this us on Bossy and hey, you guys really like Bossy, right? But it was essentially what Bossy and FBI's relationship had been informally over several years. I'd found a letter from Nick Katzenbach, who was Attorney General back in '65, a letter to, I think it's to Ray Wood, and this is I found it in the FBI's records, I think, congratulating him on his successful infiltration. So it was a very close relationship. I will say this: once the JTTF starts, it becomes an organization and practices that now were exposed to the light of day. So, I've briefed at the JTTF. I have friends over there. I respect the work they do. They do not do what the FBI did in the 1970s. They do not do what Bossy did in the 1970s. They are now beholden to the rule of law. The rule of law might change, but they at least there is oversight. While the big thing about Bossy was that there was no oversight. Even Patrick Murphy, who was commissioner, wanted to unravel Bossy. Even he thought it was where all the scary skeletons were hidden in the NYPD.
Oh, well, thank you for that.
I have nothing positive to say today. I'm very sorry.
You have a lot of information, and that is a huge positive thing. Well, do you know if Bossy was on NYPD? Were they investigating feminist organizations among all the rest?
So I've seen a few of those records, and I didn't really get that much into it. There were some investigations of, I don't know that they were investigating feminist organizations. They were investigating uh, gay rights organizations in the 70s and into the 80s and the 60s, maybe into the 60s and into the 70s. Um, they were. They were. The short answer is yes. I do think that by the time feminist and gay rights organizations really start to become prominent in New York is when Bossy is kind of taking a step back. I think that there's some really interesting work to look at in the 60s at the beginning of like right around the time of Stonewall, really. Like what kind of view NYPD had of those movements. And I didn't look a lot at it. I think that there's some records in there, and that is a book waiting to happen.
Well, would you recommend your work as retired or required reading for attorneys in New York City?
Uh, I mean, I always want to plug a book and sell a couple of books, but I honestly, I hope not. I think that it helps to inform a lot of New Yorkers, to I'm a New Yorker. My family's been in Brooklyn for about almost 200 years now. And these are stories that I didn't know. These are things that my parents and my grandparents were exposed to growing up, and even I didn't know it. And I think that it behooves us to know our history. For civil rights attorneys who, especially New York civil rights attorneys who don't know this stuff, I hope they get a little bit smarter on it. Just to understand what has been done, to understand that what happens sometimes is not new. It's not the first time around the merry-go-round, be it from my book or be it from going down and geeking out at the archive for a couple of days. I think that there are ways to know it, but I think that it is essential history if it's not essential reading.
Thanks. I think our last question before we wrap up, but probably what everyone wants to know is, do you have a next project? What's next after this?
Uh, I do. My agent hasn't sold it yet, but I'll tell you all about it. Don't steal it. I actually had thought about going back to what I know well and writing on political violence again, and probably writing on something a little bit more contemporary. And because of recent events, I didn't want to have to live in that world again for another couple of years. I found it would probably be pretty demoralizing and emotionally exhausting, considering the news cycle and everything on it these days. So I'm actually going back to the municipal archive and starting a book on the history of the New York City Marathon in the early 1970s, including looking at the records of Borough President Percy Sutton, who was instrumental in starting the first five borough marathon, which will celebrate its 50th anniversary next year. So as soon as I'm back in New York in a few months, I've already done a tremendous amount of interviews, and it's been a glorious road so far. But I've spent a couple of days at the archive looking at the Percy Sutton records. I can't wait to get back down there and just kick it into high gear.
Thank you so much. This was fantastic today.
All right, so thank you, David, again for joining us this month for our Lunch and Learn, and congratulations again on the release of your book. If you're interested in purchasing the book, we did post a link in the chat, so you'll be able to click that link and purchase from whatever retailer you'd like. And thank you for joining us, our audience. I hope that we will see you on Thursday for our next Lunch and Learn, our May Lunch and Learn, taking Manhattan with Russell Shorter. So thank you again.
I can just say last moment, just thank you from me personally as well. Thank you to everyone for joining for today, and thank you for interest not just in my project but in this record collection, and thank you for your interest in the archive, and thanks to our host for everything that they do to keep these records out there. It's only becoming more and more important as the days go by. I'm on social media. If anyone has any questions that we didn't get to today, please feel free to find me on LinkedIn or something, and we can pick it up there. I still teach at John Jay, so you can find me there. Thank you guys for everything, and be safe.
Great, thank you, everyone.